So here's the reaction of photosynthesis, kind of a general reaction. So carbon dioxide and water are used by photosynthetic organisms to produce carbohydrates. I use glucose as an example, but it can be more broad than that. And as a subproduct, oxygen is released. We good so far? Good? Okay, now let's move on. So we're going to go back to this reaction. I'm going to leave some space here. Okay. Now, photosynthesis implies the use of energy of light to convert inorganic carbon into organic. The light is absorbed by photopigments, okay? And then that energy is directed towards what's called a carbon fixation. So far we good? Okay, moving on. There are two types of reactions in photosynthesis, light dependent and light independent. We're going to start with reactions that are light dependent. So in light dependent reaction, this is the membrane. We're going to draw some structures here. Okay. I'm going to draw it as it goes. So in light-dependent reaction, light is absorbed by so-called reaction center. So this is light. Light is absorbed by so-called reaction center in a photosystem 1. Oh, sorry, photosystem 2 first. We're going to talk about photosystem 2 first. Okay, that makes sense? Light has energy. Does everybody agree with that? You're good? So photosystem 2, through multiple harvesting centers, which aren't the focus of our conversation at all. The point is, light energy is absorbed and is directed towards an electron, which gets energized from the reaction center and then goes through, I think it's 1, 2, 3 steps of electron transport chain. Now, does that picture look familiar to you? When energized electron goes from one protein to another, subsequently releasing that energy with every step. Does that picture look familiar? So the energy of electron is used to pump hydrogen ions across the membrane, and just like in oxidative respiration, hydrogen diffuses back due to this, gradient formed. Now remember this conversation about, diffusion, what diffusion, hydrogen diffusion provides energy for, directly provides energy for? ATP synthesis. Make sense so far? So here, the energy of light absorbed by photosystem 2 is used to push the electron into the electron transport chain, the membrane of thylakoids. Remember, if we're talking about multicellular organism, that's going to be thylakoids. So electron jumps from one protein of electron transport chain to another, releasing energy. This energy is used to form electrochemical gradient. This gradient drives the diffusion of hydrogen ions, and this diffusion provides the energy for ATP synthesis. Okay, so ATP will be the first important molecule produced during light-dependent reaction. Does that make sense? We good? So what happens next? We still have this electron, right? We still have this electron, really exhausted. It lost all its energy. So this electron ends up arriving at the photosystem 1. Photosystem 1 absorbs another bout of energy, light energy, which energizes this electron. This time, it doesn't enter electron transport chain. Instead, it is being accepted by NADP+. Does the acronym NADP+ look kind of familiar? Right? NAD, but also with a phosphate. So NADP+ is the third electron carrier I mentioned before. So upon the acceptance of electron, NADP+ becomes reduced, and its reduced form is NADPH, and it's the second important molecule that is produced during light-dependent reactions. Okay, so to wrap up, energy of light is absorbed by the photosystem 2. This energy pushes the electron into the electron transport chain. Electron from photosystem 2 loses the energy to the proteins of electron transport chain, which use that energy to pump hydrogen across the membrane. Electrochemical gradient that was generated drives the diffusion of hydrogen ions across the membrane through the ATP synthase, which results in the synthesis of ATP. In the meantime, this electron ends up at the photosystem 1, where it receives another bout of energy, light energy, gets energized and reduces NADP+ to NADPH. Those are two molecules, ATP and NADPH, that are produced during the photosynthesis. Does that make sense? Good? Questions? We have one unsolved problem. We have lost electron here. We need to compensate for it. How do we do it? So in this case, two molecules of water, they serve as the donors for electrons. Now, listen closely. The element that is being oxidized in this case, because water is losing an electron. Does that make sense? So water is being oxidized, but not just water is being oxidized. Oxygen in the water is being oxidized, and the result of it are proteins, well, are going to be used, and oxygen is a waste. Does that make sense to you? You good? Good? Okay. Any questions so far? Awesome. Now, what happens during light-independent reactions? In one sentence or in one phrase, a lot of biochemistry. But my focus, I really want to just, we always follow carbons. So it all starts with 3 5-carbon intermediates called ribulose biphosphate. We're going to give it name RBP, but it's not super important. Okay, now please count carbons with me, okay? It just facilitates the process of understanding what's going on. So we have 3 5-carbon intermediates, and they interact with 3 molecules of CO2. Okay, how many carbons total we see here? 80, yes, so 18 carbons. The result of this reaction, like several steps actually, are 6 3-carbon intermediate called phosphoglyceric acid, which is, it is important. It is important. Not for our purposes, okay? We are not going into the woods of biochemistry here, okay? Phosphoglyceric acid. And then you have several steps. Check this out. This is an important part. You have several steps, like it's all important part, but that result in the formation of 3-carbon phosphorylated intermediates. But look at the name. This is G3P, your old pal, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. Okay? The one that we mentioned when we discussed glycolysis, to remember that. Glycolysis thing, okay? So now, G3P in glycolysis is the product of glucose breakdown. Does that make sense? But in this case, one molecule of G3P will be used for glucose synthesis. Now, let me ask you this. If you had 6 molecules of this 3-carbon intermediates, and then you take one molecule and take it away, how many molecules do you have left? It's not 5. So how many carbons total? 15. So then, these 15 carbons are going to be rearranged to produce another 3 molecules of RBP, ribulose biphosphate. Does that make sense? Are we clear? So, what's the importance of ATP and NADPH? So it turns out that you need ATP and NADPH here. You need energy and you need electrons. You need energy to form bonds and you need electrons to reduce phosphoglyceric acid. Okay? So this is where the products of your light-dependent reactions enter the light-independent reactions. Does that make sense? Okay? So this cycle here is called Calvin-Benson cycle. Now here's a little question for you, like really small question. How many carbons we have here? 3. No, 3 CO2, right? 3 CO2, 3 carbons. How many carbons we have here? 3. So what essentially happens during Calvin-Benson cycle? 3 carbons of CO2, inorganic carbons, are converted into 3 organic carbons. This is called a carbon fixation. In biology, in biochemistry, in microbiology, the term fixation refers to a very specific set of processes. It is when an element, whatever it is converted from from inorganic molecule into usable organic form. Does that make sense? This is when you take nitrogen and incorporate it into proteins. This is nitrogen fixation. When you take phosphorus from phosphate and incorporate it into organic molecules, this is phosphorus fixation. When you take carbon and you incorporate it into organic molecule, this is carbon fixation. Are we clear? We good? Any questions? Questions? No? Okay. A little bit of philosophy, biophilosophy here. The point that I promised myself not to talk about it during reviews, but I just can't not to do that. So here's, honestly, you don't have to write it. You don't have, I'm not going to ask this question on the exam, I promise. But it's an interesting thought experiment here. So we've got two reactions, one under another, right? Look at these two reactions. They are essentially the same reaction, written, left to right, right to left. Are we clear? So the reaction on top is photosynthesis. Reaction on the bottom is respiration. Good? So now, in the overall ecosystem, photosynthetic organisms, such as cyanobacteria, unicellular algae, and plants, they run top reaction. We good? Now the bottom reaction is respiration. So all organisms that respire, they do the bottom one. You clear? Now let me tell you something. Plants, they respire. And they respire practically the same, they use practically the same amount of oxygen. Very close to they produce. Does that make sense? Which kind of completely defeats the statement that plants are the lungs of the planet. And this statement that plants are, or Amazon forests are the lungs of the planet, this statement is biologically incorrect in many levels. First of all, plants do produce oxygen, but they use a lot of oxygen. That makes sense. Second, let me tell you that plants are not even the main producers of oxygen in the world. The main producers of oxygen are unicellular algae, mostly in the Pacific Ocean. About half of all oxygen is produced by those algae. Okay, so not saying that we can burn Amazonian forests to the ground, but just, kind of a reality check here. But here's another thing. If a lot of organisms respire and only photosynthetic organisms produce oxygen, how do we manage to maintain, how does biosphere manage to maintain the proper levels of oxygen in the biosphere, right? So we're kind of jumping a little bit ahead of a train, but I just want to give you that food for thought. So plants take CO2 from the air and put it in plants, algae, whatever, photosynthetic organisms, form organic carbon. Does that make sense? We good? And then heterotrophs of different sorts, from bacteria and fungi to animals and humans, use that organic carbon as the source of chemical energy, generating CO2. Does that make sense? Big question. Does all organic carbon that is generated by photosynthetic organisms gets quote-unquote eaten by heterotrophs? No, of course not. Some of organisms, like some of organic carbon, when I say organic carbon, it's essentially plants, animals, fungi, any phytoplankton, zooplankton, all of that stuff. Some of those organisms, when they die, they never see oxygen again. They can sink at the bottom of the ocean. Does that make sense? Or they can be stored or sink like in the marshes and swamps. Basically, once you take carbon and put it in some anaerobic conditions, organic carbon, this reaction is never going to happen. Are you following me? Which means this oxygen will never be used. Which means we spare some oxygen. Does that make sense? And as long as we spare oxygen, we're fine. So basically what I'm trying to tell you, very sort of, plants are important. Photosynthetic organisms are important. But realistically, the real lungs of the planet are oceans, swamps, and marshes. Or at least you should acknowledge their role in maintaining the proper levels of oxygen in the atmosphere. Does that make sense? Okay.